One of the vital things we learn from Adorno is that we should be exceedingly suspect of the positive. And he's right. I think this is no more important than in the domain of politics. But there are other ideological forces that harness the toxicity of the positive, such as the psychological. But it is indeed important within the domain of politics to remain suspect, to remain suspicious of the narratives that are put forth in society. Now, this toxic positivity manifests itself in so many different ways, in so many different domains, because it almost functions as a kind of logic. And as I said, one of the other domains besides politics is the domain of psychology, in which this toxic positivity functions. Within this domain, the positive disguises itself best of all. Never has the conformity to tyranny had a better ally in structuring the world according to its ideology. Here, the psychologist plays the role of enforcer and narrative shaper, and in the worst possible way, by attacking the sanity of the person who fails to conform to the tyranny of a backward system. Few ever see the primitiveness of their own culture in their time. Thought must do its work in the primate to its highest degree in order to achieve this sight. In order to be able to see through one's culture, in order to be able to contextualize one's culture from a transcendent point of history, thought must do its work in the primate to its highest degree in order for the primate to achieve this sight. In psychology, positivity is not without its healing effect. But when positivity begins to function as an unofficial ideology of what we might say the Reich, reinforcing the norms of the Reich, our society, reinforcing the norms of an administration, demanding that those who fail to conform to these norms are abnormal, then psychology has simply become an unconscious tool of ideology. One can only shiver at the thought of how high many of these psychologists view themselves. What a wonderful world of validation and delusion to live in. Imagine a psychologist within a world that was dominated by the Third Reich. Imagine that psychologist replicating, administering, enforcing, and dispersing a narrative that is put forth by this tyrannical totalitarian system of the Reich. And the psychologists simply rehash this as normative, as the central norms of the system. This thought experiment of using the Reich allows us to see the danger of psychology merely adopting the values of the culture in which it finds itself. If it truly wants to achieve an understanding of health, then it has to strike out not to merely validate the cultural precepts in which it finds itself, but it must have a transcendent view. It must have an overarching view of society and culture and the human, so that it can see things from a third-person perspective, or from the vantage of a more advanced species. And it can, in a sense, look down, and from that perspective, evaluate or arrive at an understanding of what it means to function at a higher level, instead of merely just replicating what psychology is given by the authoritarian structure, the official structure of the culture in which it finds itself. I would go so far as to say that if psychology can't do this, if it is incapable of trying to put forward the transcendent view, then it's going to struggle in arriving at definitions of health, of psychological well-being, that have a higher accuracy level, a higher intelligence level in their formation. For every nonconformist in this society, in a society that is dominated by a Third Reich, every nonconformist that a psychologist in that society comes into contact with becomes proof that the psychologist has obtained to the highest level of sanity, and that this administered totalitarian system of the Reich really is what it claims to be. You see the danger here? The danger here is that within a system, if psychology functions this way, merely replicating the culture as psychological health, then every time psychology comes into contact with what it considers to be a nonconformist within that society, psychology uses that to reinforce its own delusion and its own ideological structure. It uses it to reinforce the dogma of its culture, a culture that it has received from the administration itself, that it has mindlessly adopted, and it uses the instances of nonconformists to validate this ideology to itself. It uses these instances of interacting with people to validate the values of the Reich, that the Reich is in fact has achieved the status of the highest level of sanity, the highest level of goodness, the highest level of intelligence. All of it exists within this particular culture, and we are merely validating and administering the values of this culture. And this, of course, is a tyrannical culture. It's a culture that's condemned and doomed by its own dogma. Woe unto those who get caught up in this kind of culture. But the point is that an ideology of normativity is unconsciously wielded as reality. That's the point. That the psychologist, that psychology within this cultural structure, that the culture itself is unconscious of the fact that it is administering, wielding an ideology as though it were ultimate reality. And that is not necessarily the case of the situation, but it doesn't matter, because the authoritarian structure, that is the way that authoritarianism functions. This is the great danger of positivity. This is why it's crucial to always remain suspect, even if this disposition is considered to be pathological or morbid. It is the price that one must pay for freedom. In order to move in the direction of freedom, in order to proceed toward the realization of freedom in thought, it is necessary to maintain a suspicious disposition toward cults of positivity. The question of the nature of positivity is also important. What rises up in the name of positivity, intuitively defined as the ultimate reality of health, is unconsciously structured so as to deny inherent and inconvenient facts of reality that negate the lie of the totality of this ideological positivity. The only salvation from the tyranny of this lie is the negative, is a disposition of suspicion toward the positive, is the dialectical ability to see through the mere appearance of forms, to see through their immediacy and penetrate into their contradictory essence. This is crucial. The salvation that comes from the lie of positivity and the tyranny of positivity that imposes itself is obtained through a disposition of the negative, is obtained through the dialectical ability to see through the mere appearance of forms, which means that the individual is not deceived by immediacy. It means that the individual has the capacity to think beyond the mere appearance of a concept, to peer into the diversity of its nature, to see behind that appearance, and to probe into its essence so that it can better understand the object in its concrete totality. To overcome the false positive is an act of freedom that requires the activity of negativity. At the base of reality lies the interaction of a biological world. The positive is usually set up to deny the intricacies of this reality. Because the biological world pushes so much against man's conceptual world, and specifically against the conceptual world that man desires, man would seem to be in the business of constantly constructing idealisms in order to combat the reductive nature of reality that he doesn't like. Now, when I say reductive nature, this is a little bit misleading. This is a loaded term that idealists like to use against materialists, but it's really not reductive. The idealist position is really the reductive position, the position that looks at the actual diversity of the biological structure is a position that is actually realizing a vast complexity. So it's not actually reducing, it's just the opposite. It is taking a binary form of thinking, a form of thinking that is pleasant, psychologically pleasant to the human, because it gives the human the delusion of being able to control the world and reality. But by looking at the biological structure and the infinite complexity that we find there, it's not really a reduction. We are simply realizing that reality is more complex than we can comprehend, and so we simply try to press into it as best we can and continue to understand it as best we can. In psychology, the positive form is set up to deny the biological nature of reality. Man is always trying to fabricate an idealism that excludes the complexity of reality because this complexity causes him psychological pain. The primate cannot bear it. Thus does he seek to fabricate reality as a story that makes him feel better about reality. Man then imposes this story. He demands allegiance to it. The danger of psychology is if it walks this path without knowing it. It, of all human vocations, should know better. But alas, the false positive arises through it, and men begin to impose it. And where that positivity is rejected, men begin to judge. Men begin to attack the very foundation of social being, that of sanity, that of an individual's sanity. But these positivists are incompetent. Their attack amounts to a moral attack against the person. One becomes immoral because they will not conform. Psychological splitting conveniently plays itself out at the highest point of its inception. The creator now becomes the unconscious practitioner, thereby wielding the power of his own creation. Humans are constantly trying to get away from unpleasant feelings they don't like or from things they fear. And because of this, they are constantly in the process of constructing idealisms. Now, as a positive structure is erected within society, and authority is attributed to that positive structure obtains authority. Those who try to resist against it are essentially attacked in a way where they are charged with falling outside the domain of reality. Now, I want to be clear here that when I talk about this pushing back against society, I'm not referring to the fact that every single person that is engaged in the process of nonconformity is somehow an example of a resistor who is in fact resisting against a tyrannical system. There are cases, in fact, indeed a great deal of psychology and psychiatry is accurate when it diagnoses individuals with having disorders wherein they in fact do have a defect or a crisis within their stability and within their sanity. But this same form is played out within tyrannical societies, societies that try to erect a false positive, a positive that becomes a tyranny because it is really structured to try to move away from the complexity of reality, to simplify it so as to try to control it, to force society to conform to a narrow set of standards that really lead it down a path of regression. And so individuals are attacked from a moral vantage point And the one claims that they are immoral because they will not conform. And then there is this psychological splitting that takes place within society that is the psychology vantage point is unconscious of, because it defaults to painting the world as all good or all evil, and it classifies these individuals that reject these value structures into a classification of being evil, of being insane. The point is to cultivate a critical disposition. The point is to know that one should be suspicious of positivity. The point is to know that this positivity will never present itself as toxic and will fight to the death to retain its image of itself as positive. That's very important. This positivity will never present itself as toxic. It will present itself as authoritative, as healthy, as sane. It will never manifest itself as being authoritarian, as being regressive. And it will fight to the death to defend itself as having value, as being positive. The reality that it is designed to circumvent is the reality of reality's complexity. That things are not so simple that they can merely be fixed by claiming, for example, that individuals merely need to exercise to remedy their state of depression. There's a lot more going on than merely a failure of the power of the will. But toxic positivity reduces the world to a kind of simplicity, to narratives that it can easily force on people and classify them into a category of psychological splitting, so it can demonize them and then justify harsh treatment of them. But not only this, this toxic positivity, this toxic narrative is also designed to circumvent compassion, the necessity of society to function as a resource for humans, as opposed to it reinforcing oppressive and depriving conditions and structures. Humans need help. That's why we form societies in the first place. The false positive denies this reality because it redefines the way in which humans need help. It says they merely need the right positive ideals, when in fact they need resources, access to the space and goods of the earth. The false positive tries to control the narrative of need by holding it hostage to idealism. Idealism is all the human needs. This is their philosophy. What does that mean? Idealism is all the human needs. That the only thing humans need to fix themselves, to make society function, the only thing that's needed is the right set of ideals and then the will to carry out those ideals. You see, here's the reduction, the tyrannical reduction, that the human and reality is reduced to a crude will to power, that the biological domain is denied, that the complex interaction and development of society and individuals is denied, that necessities, existential necessities are denied, that everything is reduced down to a crude will to power, that idealism is all the human needs, and to apply that idealism to the function of life, and one will get a good result. But this is not the case. Everyone is not born into equal conditions. The playing field is not equal. Some people face a lot more adversity, and because of it, the quality of their lives is impaired or altogether sabotaged. But alas, critical thought, by default being suspicious of positivity, sees through these lies. It knows it's being duped. It knows that reality is more complex than the ideology of positivity that tries to control it through a false narrative and false frame. This is why it is essential for us to cultivate a disposition of negativity, a disposition of of suspicion toward the positive, a disposition of negativity. This is crucial because it leaves us in a position to identify the false positive, and we could define the false positive as a form of tyranny, because that's what it is. It is ultimately a form of false tyranny. Art becomes a form of false tyranny. And the more power it obtains, the more official power a false positive obtains, the more tyrannical and destructive it becomes, because it is not an idealism. It is not a conceptualism that is actually rooted in an accurate understanding of the complexes and nuances of reality. It is an ideology that is seeking to reduce reality so that it can deceive itself that it has better control over reality. Rising up in the world is the tyranny of a toxic positivity, is the tyranny of a false positivity. And this will take on many forms, and it will contain many attributes, and one of these attributes is that it will deny states of suffering to humans, or it will blame humans for their states of suffering that they were born into, states of suffering that were beyond their control. And it will blame them for these states, for these conditions, for these dispositions, and it will demand that they can adhere to a crude will to power, and that the solution to all problems in the world is simply a will to power, and that those who have hard lives, those who are not successful, those who are impoverished, have done it to themselves because they did not intelligently or accurately take heed to a positive idealism, to a false positivity, which is really an error, a delusion, a lie, a deception, a distortion of reality, because they did not take heed to this and exercise a crude will to power. The suffering of their life is on their own hands, and they alone are to blame for it. There is no other external circumstances that bore down to impede their life or to sabotage the well-being of their existence. It will be a denial of suffering, and it will be a tyranny that operates through a positive ideology.